In the article Sexual Perversion, the author Thomas Nagel begins his argument by listing three criteria that must be met in order to classify something as sexually perverse. The first being that sexual desires or practices of any kind will be sexual perversions and unnatural in a sense. Second, that certain practices like fetishes of objects as animals will be seen as perverse, but unadorned sexual intercourse will not. Lastly, Nagel says that if there are perversions, they will be unnatural sexual inclinations rather than merely unnatural practices adopted not from inclination but for other reasons. Nagel goes on to make the claim that a sexual perversion must reveal itself in conduct that expresses an unnatural sexual preference, meaning that for something to be sexually perverse, it must be unnatural and have a certain psychological complexity. Nagel introduces the concept of sexual desire being an appetite like hunger or thirst as a point of skepticism to his argument. He does not agree with this concept, stating that, like hunger, sexual desire has its characteristic object, a certain relation with something in the external world. Only in this case, it is usually a person rather than an omelet, which is the food that he uses, and the relation is considerably more complicated with humans. To give scenarios of what may and may not be classified as a sexual perversion, Nagel uses the example of someone who liked to eat cookbooks or magazines with pictures of food in them, or seeking satisfaction by fondling a napkin or ashtray from their favorite restaurant. These examples would seem appropriate to be labeled as sexually perverse strictly because of the relationship one possesses with the objects, as opposed to eating paper, sand, or wood, as some examples Nagel provides as not sexually perverse. This relationship between a person and the object they desire is a key point in Nagel's argument for what is sexually perverse. In the argument, it mentions things that have no bearing on sexual perversion at all, such as the connection between sex and reproduction. He supports this statement by saying that just because something has reproductive functions, such as a lower animal or plant, that they can't be sexually perverse, since sexual perversion deals specifically with psychological principles instead of physiological. Another matter Nagel feels has no bearing on sexual perversion is customs of societies which vary from culture to culture. So if one society disapproves of something, this does not necessarily prohibit it in other societies. Nagel also describes the perceptions involved with sexual desire. More specifically, the complex system of superimposed mutual perceptions. He uses the example of Romeo and Juliet in order to demonstrate the perceptions of not just the sexual object, but also of you. First there is the sensing of another and being aroused by them. Then there is the sensing of the other person sensing, or becoming aroused. This is followed by the sensing of the other person sensing you in particular. This means that you, the person, become aroused because the other person is aroused, which is another level of perception and interaction. This process started out with self-awareness and resulted in mutual awareness. I agree with Nagel's argument because he understands and proves the ways in which people interact with one another on a psychological level. He's able to provide very good examples of how people see one another and determine a good basis on what should and what should not be considered sexually perverse. His examples of the people eating cookbooks and then people eating things like dirt and sand correlated well with the relationship between people and their sexual desires. As a whole, Nagel provides solid evidence and examples in order to back his original claim in what constitutes as a sexual preference.